Good morning, everyone. We've got lots of folks coming in, so we will give people about 30 more seconds to start. Before we start, for those of you who haven't joined us on one of our webinars before, my name is Noelle Mykolenko. I am the CEO of Trusted Advisor Associates. I'm very excited to have two guests here today, our founder and co-author of The Trusted Advisor, Charlie Green, and his fellow co-author, Rob Galford. See, we're coming up on a couple of more folks. So we're going to start off. Let's go ahead and get started here. We are going to start off with just a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded. You should have seen a comment to that effect while you were in the waiting room. We're going to have a slightly different format for this webinar than our others. This one is going to be a panel discussion with Rob and Charlie for 30 minutes. And I would ask you to hold your questions or type them into chat as we go along. And we've reserved 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. We will send out the links to the recording, the presentation. We may not send the presentation this time because it's really just going to be Charlie and Rob, and follow-up resources. And if you're game, go ahead and turn your camera on so that we can see you during the webinar. Please type your questions into the chat if something comes up rather than trying to interrupt or raising your hand. We will get to your questions after the panel discussion. So before we launch in with Rob and Charlie, I'm going to do a quick poll. The topic of today's webinar, of course, is 20 Years of Trust. We're introducing the 20th anniversary edition of the Trusted Advisor book. So I just want to get a sense from you all. How familiar are you with the Trusted Advisor book? Go ahead and submit your answers. We'll give people another 20 seconds or so, Tracy. And I'm going to let you tell me when we have enough.
I read it once.
I've heard of it. We were laughing before. I was telling Charlie and Rob, every time I talk about the book, I raise this up with all of my tabs and all of my highlights and everything. All right, Tracy, how are we on responses to that poll? There we go.
Oh, 40% read it. Great.
Excellent. And I love that 33% say it's your go-to resource. Fantastic. For those of you who've never heard of it before, you are in for a treat because today we have two co-authors, as I mentioned, Rob Galford and Charlie Green. And I'm going to stop speaking right now and let you two introduce yourselves before we start into the questions. So Charlie, let's start off with you.
Okay, I'm Charlie Green, co-author with Rob. I spent, Rob and I met years, centuries ago at Harvard Business School, became fast friends, and our careers have intertwined when we, co-wrote The Trusted Advisor 21 years ago. I had an undergraduate major in philosophy, drove a taxi part-time in New York City while in college, went on to Harvard Business School, which is where I met Rob, and I spent 20 years in management consulting until about 1995 when I found my way into what ended up being a second career built on this book. So that's enough about me. Rob?
Right. And I am the example of those who can do, those who can't teach, those who can't teach consult. And I spent the past 20 years or so teaching consultants, which really shows that I guess I have yet to find exactly my place. Well, other than that, though, a little more seriously, after Charlie and I met, I spent my time in all in professional services firms, investment management, strategy consulting, the practice of law. So I really came to know and love professional services firms as a place where the work that really interested and satisfied me went on. And from there, it's been consulting and teaching and working with folks on these kinds of questions on building trust.
Let me just do a quick shout out too. I see Andrea Howe is with us here. Andrea is co-author with me of the Trusted Advisor Field Book, been integral business partner to me and Trusted Advisor Associates over the year, and worthy of a special shout out. Thanks, Andrea.
All right, thanks, guys. Great introductions. I'm really excited to hear from you both what your perspectives are as you went into redoing the book and updating it for the 20th anniversary edition. So first of all, just share with us a little bit about why you wrote the original book back in 2000.
I'll take a lead on that. It was kind of serendipitous. I mean, we got invited to do a quick hour session at a huge partner development program for Deloitte and Touche. And due to an accident, there was an opening in the slot, and the client said, "Can you guys quickly throw together something on the idea of a trusted advisor?" And we said, "Sure, we're good consultants. We'll do a 2x2 matrix." And we did it. It worked out well. He said, "See if you can make it 2 hours," and it just kind of built. So it was more serendipity and luck than anything. Rob, is that how you remember it?
Yeah, absolutely. From a logistical standpoint and the practical standpoint, exactly. I think one of the things that united us was very, very quickly having, as Charlie said, our careers had intertwined up to that point for quite a while. I think we both realized one way or the other that content didn't conquer all. Just from an intellectual standpoint, expertise was a necessary but not sufficient condition for success. And when you start to look at professional services firms and those who excel in the professions, how many of them were more than just great expertise or great content? The real distinguishing factors turned out to be the things that I think we built the trusted advisor concept on.
Yeah, and Rob and I sort of started off writing this book based on that success in the program. And then we ran into David Maister. I'd known David some years before, but Rob ran into him. And David basically said, "Hey, I'm writing the same book. If you guys want to make me lead author," because he'd already published 9 books. He said, "I'll solve your publishing problem," because we hadn't been able to generate any interest. So we thought for a nanosecond, said, "Welcome, lead author." And that was then the 3 of us. And he just picked up the phone and called, and we had a deal with Simon & Schuster. And the rest is history.
That's right. The rest is history. Although David has now gone on to a pure retirement profile.
Yep.
He's of an age and a state that is where he is best suited at this point. And he's a good encourager of our work, though.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to riff off of this for a second and go off script. So heads up on the curveball coming, guys. When you wrote the book originally in 2000, it sounds like it was intended to be for an audience of primarily consultants, professional services.
Yeah.
I have to say, for the last 10 years that I've been involved with Trusted Advisor Associates, we have a really broad audience. What do you think about the applicability of the book to more than just the consulting field?
Well, you're right. It has become more applicable. And that was one of the things that we had in mind in doing the rewrite, to recognize that fact, because it's relevant to financial planners. It's relevant to coaches. It's relevant to, lots of different audiences other than the core professional services. So that's part of what we built into the rewrite, different examples and thoughts. And I think the readership led us in that direction, but it was implicit there all the time, as many of them pointed out.
That's right. And I would even add that in addition to the logical extension across roles that people play, the other thing we found, which I found out, is that in addition to the pure trusted advisor concept, the trust concepts themselves have tremendous levels of applicability. So building those trusted relationships internally, I spend a tremendous amount of time working with on C-suite relationships, CEO, COO, the head of a university and the dean, 2 partners who are now co-managing directors, those kinds of things, which are somewhat different, but certainly aligned to the trusted advisor concepts entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear you. And when we do workshops and we get feedback from people as they're putting these into practice, some of the most gratifying responses we hear are those people who apply the trust concepts across every area of their life.
Yep.
And we've had stories of people making incredible personal breakthroughs with family members, with significant others.
Right.
And that applicability is huge.
Well, when you think about it, trust is a pretty fundamental human experience or relationship or whatever. And, going back to, writing the book, we were a little bit lucky to glom onto this key notion. You say the phrase trusted advisor, and almost everybody immediately conjures up some image of what that means. And nobody had copyrighted that term. Nobody had written a book by that name. It was kind of waiting to be written. And we were lucky enough to be first in line. Is
Good.
very applicable across all kinds of human experience.
Excellent. So let's fast forward 20 years, right? So a couple of years ago, we started talking about, hey, the book's coming up on its 20th anniversary. Is it still applicable? What needs to change? I'm going to start, Rob, with you this time
Okay.
and ask you, what are the big events or evolutions that drove you to want to republish the book?
Right. Good question. And there's a question as to whether book years and human years and dog years have a relationship. So by some multiplications, this thing could be 140 years old if we're not careful. I think that you put your finger on it and said it's an evolution. It was more evolution than revolution. It was time. And I think there were three factors that pointed in that direction. And again, this is a little off script too. The first of them was demographics and definition. Simply how we define the roles that people are playing has, as you folks have noted, at Trusted Advisor Associates, have expanded fairly dramatically from the pure professional services lane. And in other capacities, your work in sales, for example, as you think about it, the fact that we have customer success parts of organizations now. So one is just the very nature of who is in those kinds of roles. The other demographic element of that is the fact that, at one point our target audience, books have a certain sort of shelf life. Our target audience is now 20 years older than they were before. We could be missing an entire generation if we're not careful. And we wanted to attend to that. The second change, I think, or evolution is culture, how business takes place. And that really talks about the third in terms of levels of formality and informality and those kinds of things. And the third is purely technology. The nature of technology has changed the entire basis upon which people interact and how they interact. And it's a dimension that previously was just not present in any way. And that's changed every dimension of trust.
Yeah, of those three, I think Rob's right. The one that presented most nakedly, the one the publisher was most interested in, was technology. If you go back 20 years, this was literally before Mark Zuckerberg entered Harvard, and therefore way before Facebook. It was a couple of years after Google got founded. The iPhone was I think, I forget whether just out or not out yet.
7 years in the future.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's really different. We mentioned in the foreword that the original audience kind of grew up with a personal relationship with John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And many of the readers now, that's a story that their parents tell them. So there's a radical shift. That the technology, you would think on the face of it, oh my gosh, that has totally changed relationships. Well, once we started diving into it, no, it hasn't. We would argue, I think Rob agrees with this, that the fundamentals still apply. And if anything, because our interpersonal interactions have gotten less, smaller, shorter, more distant, the importance is not lessened. If anything, it's increased. If you have less personal interactions, they count more. Human beings have not been biologically redesigned. So the technology thing ended up being a bit of a red herring. Yes, it affects how we get along with people, but it doesn't change the fundamental need to connect with people on the basis of trust.
Right. And in fact, you put your finger on an interesting word there. It was the personal interactions. Because actually, I sometimes think that the 20th anniversary edition is really the Heisenberg uncertainty principle meets trusted advisor. You remember from high school physics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, momentum and position were both so uncertain, it was hard to put them together. We actually now see more human interactions, but they're technology based as opposed to interpersonal interactions. So you can have far greater contact in terms of frequency. But what that does is it ups the ante on the need to make sure that the nature of them is of a higher quality.
Excellent. What other changed perspectives do you have about trust? I mean, the points you're making about the impact of technology are fantastic, right? You can have broader interaction and more frequent interaction with people. And the asynchronous nature of it certainly helps. What about some of those other evolution and changes that you talked about? How have those impacted trust building?
Well, one is if you pick up the business press or any newspaper or TV or something, when you hear the word trust nowadays, it is more likely to be institutional trust or social trust, or, I trust the government, I trust the police, I trust, Google or whatever. And so I think the word has kind of shifted from a predominantly psychological, interpersonal perspective to more of a social. And this book, just to be clear, is 98% about the personal. But you have to recognize, and there's obviously overlaps, but there are differences too. You know, I often say I trust Amazon, but I don't trust the Amazon driver to babysit my granddaughter. There is a difference, and I think with the socialization and the distance and the Zoom and the pandemic and everything, we've kind of gotten distant. It's easy to think that trust really is this broad sociological phenomenon. It's easy to forget that it's still fundamentally also between two human beings, and that's what we choose to emphasize. It's very, very important.
All right, I'm going to dive a little bit more into what's the same, but before we go there, just big takeaway, one from each of you. What's your biggest takeaway in the trust building? Like what's changed? Sorry, what's changed with trust building? Really capture it in one quick shot. I feel like I stumped you.
Bob, you want to go first?
Thanks a lot, buddy. I was actually hoping you were going to ask the what hasn't changed, because that's such a softball.
We're going there next.
Okay, but I think what has changed actually in terms of really what's different now goes into the fact that the importance of the quality of the interaction has shifted in some ways, because there is such ubiquity of possible interactions with regard to technology. There are many more means of being in touch interpersonally, even one-on-one. You know, once upon a time, 20 years ago, you were either doing it by mail or you were picking up the phone. Now, you can be texting, you can be, broadcasting, you can be FaceTiming, et cetera, et cetera. So the entire nature of interaction, because Charlie and I really do believe this is so much of a personal element, has shifted in how it takes place. And as a result, there are mechanisms by which people can escape that as well, either intentionally or unintentionally. 20 years ago, we never thought about the word ghosting, but now everybody has either ghosted or been ghosted,
Yeah.
or knows someone who has. And so those kinds of things, not even in the parlance, not even in the mindset now. And I think that's one of the areas you've changed. So that the importance, when I was kind of teasing about Heisenberg, the importance of the nature of the interaction really has dramatically shifted.
Yeah, I build on kind of the same thought and take it a different direction. There's so much of these sort of looks like trust, looks like interpersonal,
right?
Facebook, et cetera. That I think many people mistake it. I think there may be a generational effect of this, but whatever. I would note, for example, I bet everybody on this call has is the victim of LinkedIn marketing. Somebody sends you something on LinkedIn, it's a piece, and the tools are all there to get really good at targeting, to narrow your audience. But what I notice is all of them, almost every single one I get, they've narrowed the audience, let's say. So presumably I'm a potential client, but there's absolutely nothing personal in the message. It is cranked out just like spam email was or direct mail was 20 years ago.
Right.
And that's insane. I mean, LinkedIn, for example, is a great tool. You can find out a lot about people. And we've forgotten that the power of technology can be used to personalize, to find out something direct about someone and make a real connection, and not just to target them as the basis of an automated campaign. So I think all that falls under, it's gotten kind of fuzzy and easy to kid ourselves that interpersonal trust is accomplished through scaling on digital platforms. No, it's not. Destroyed by that kind of thing. So I think what we tried to emphasize in the 20th anniversary is the real stuff is still the real stuff. You need to reach out. You need to have a personal connection. I see one question in here, we can talk about it later, but how do you do this? Well, here's a real simple example. You find somebody on LinkedIn, you want to make a connection, don't say, would you like to hop on the phone? No, you haven't even met. You make some comment first that progresses it, like, hey, I noticed you guys had a big snowstorm in Minneapolis last night. How did that work out for you? That says, hey, I see you. I recognize you are a person living in a particular place. This is me, not a bot putting this out there. Let's chat. That's how you progress it.
So, Charlie, I want to follow up on that, and I kind of know what your answer is. So I'm going to point this at Rob.
Okay.
That you guys weren't at all ready for how I'm doing this.
That's okay.
But I want to get your perspective, Rob, because it sounds like technology is a bit of a double-edged sword, right? It gives
Right.
us many more options to be able to personalize, to be able to connect with someone. And at the same time, it also gives us a lot of wiggle room to be inauthentic or to just exit the conversation. Now, when you think about personalizing and recognizing that mass personalization is in fact an oxymoron, not that
Right.
people see it that way, but
Right.
when you think about personalizing in something like what Charlie said, how do you reconcile that against the increasing concerns around privacy? Or, wow, is this person cyber stalking me?
If
That's
they're
kind of,
stalking me, right.
yeah. And I'm
And I
throwing it
think,
at you because I've had the conversation with Charlie. So,
right. Well, I think you raise, an interesting point and the right point. There's a doctrine in the law that talks about expectation of privacy. What you can and can't pick up in a search. And for those of you who've had criminal law 101, you may remember things like the fruit of the poisonous tree from an illegal search and seizure. This is stuff that's out there, and I think part of it is not quite a disclaimer, but a disclosure. Say, look, there are no secrets in this world, so to speak. Here's what I found out. And in fact, in the new edition, one of the people whom I admire greatly, a woman named Yvonne Wassenaar, who's the CEO of an entity called
Yeah.
Puppet, actually makes the point, and Puppet's a software firm based out in the Northwest. But Yvonne made the point when we were talking to her, saying, look, here was somebody who had obviously done their homework on things I had written, things I had posted. And that was a differentiator because it wasn't just scraped off the web. They had actually read the stuff. And she found that a personally valuable connection as opposed to somebody who might have, who was very clear about it. And I think that's the kind of thing we look for. Otherwise,
Right.
People can find it a little sort of creepy, but, disclose it. Hey, here's what I know about you. Hey, if it's on LinkedIn, it's fair game at this point to refer to it. And why not?
Yeah,
Or not just LinkedIn, but any equivalent.
it's about transparency and intention.
Absolutely.
If the intention's good, and as
Right.
Rob said, it's out there. It's amazing how well that can work. It's a form of respect. I read your stuff. I'm not just throwing a title out there that I,
Yeah.
copied and pasted. Yeah.
good. Excellent. All right. Now we're going to get back to what I know you guys really want to talk about, and that is what hasn't changed since 2000.
Oh, only for out of respect. Let me give Charlie the softball first.
Well, basically, everything has not changed. The fundamentals of human interactions. Listen, I mean, human beings have been around for eons and millennia, thousands of years, basically in the same biological form that we've existed. We're not that different. And in the last 20 years, there have been no fundamental rewrites of our genetic code, of our mental capabilities, of our emotional makeup. We are social beings. We are, rational and irrational beings. We are fill in the blank with all the things that describe human. It's distracting to say, oh my God, technology has happened, everything's digital. We have not changed. So the challenge is just to swim through a slightly different environment and rediscover the basic fundamentals that connect people. So, I mean, that we kind of went through that discovery again, rewriting the book. I think we sort of believed that to begin with, but as we went through it, combed through all the chapters, first of all, we had originally thought about putting a new chapter in on the internet or digital. And then we very quickly said, no, this infuses the whole book. And the more we rewrote it, the more we realized it is still the same stuff. It's just a different environment that's changed. So that's my take on it, Rob.
Shorter answer, 3 words. The trust equation hasn't changed.
Yep.
And that hasn't changed. And in fact, I think the thing that in some ways put us on the map out of the trusted advisor really was the trust equation.
Agreed.
And people will recognize that who haven't read the book, but somewhere along the line, they've either picked it up or it was part of some training program and those kinds of things. And the factors in the trust equation, credibility, reliability, intimacy, over self-orientation in all its forms, just continues to be evergreen, and people get that. It's sort of one of these, my father was a social science professor many, many years ago, and used to say, sometimes what is most successful is the arduous explanation of the intuitively obvious. And in some ways, the obvious, what seemed to us, the trust equation, just right there.
Yeah.
Great. Good. Any other comments on what hasn't changed or things that you may have shifted as we reach the conclusion of this interview?
Charlie, go first. I got 1 or 2.
Well, somebody was asking in chat, how big different is it? We took out entire chapters. There used to be a chapter about Lieutenant Columbo, which if you've never heard of Lieutenant Columbo, forget about it. That's why we took it out. It's a generational thing. But that's, there's another Lieutenant Columbo reference that could be made in place of that one. So a lot of it was, cultures have changed, language has changed,
Right.
but the fundamentals have not.
Yeah, I would say what has changed maybe a little bit is less in sort of what's in the book, what's not in the book. It's just in the real life things that I know, Charlie, you and I have both talked about. We talk about tools and skills a lot. And one of the little frames we use is the ability to engage, listen, frame, envision, commit. And there, I think one of the things that really you and I both noted, and I give you credit for this, Charlie, first, and I think you and Noelle and your work have seen this, is around this question of the listening. That if you go back to engage, listen, frame, vision, commit, the one that I think we may have not quite underestimated the importance of, but didn't accentuate as much as, gee, that listening element now, it's
Yes.
just that moment when people said, boy, they're really listening. They get, not just they get it, but they get me. And
Yeah.
that I think is one of the most kind of profound things. The other one is from
Rob, sorry for stepping on you there.
No.
That's absolutely correct. In the work that we do with Trusted Advisor Associates, we put a lot of emphasis. If you think about it, listening is one of the most profound ways in which people convey to other people their intentions, their interests, their respect. It's a prime example of reciprocity, which is kind of a fundamental, another aspect of people. We return good for good and bad for bad. And one of the things we return is respect. And one of the ways you show respect is by listening and paying attention to people. All of us on this call who come through the professions and so forth, we're used to listening as a way to deductively narrow down the 20 question choices or to get to the right answer. And we forget that the act of listening, like leaning in, paying attention, wow is a full sentence, for example. Those are the things that convey to another human being, you matter to me. It's your agenda. I'm interested wherever you want to go. So the importance of that listening thing, hard to overstate.
Yeah, so it's kind of a way to welcome people into our tribe, right? They feel accepted. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left here. And so I'm gonna ask you two to take out your crystal balls.
Great.
And look into the future. So as a final thought, 60 seconds from each of you, given how far we've come in the last 20 years, where do you think trust is heading in the future?
Charlie, let me throw that to you first.
Oh, thanks a lot. I think, what's the phrase? Your mileage may vary or past performance is no guide to future. I think you can connect the dots here. I think that we're not all the way down the curve of getting more automated, distant, digital, et cetera. There's more for that to go. So the tension between what we think of as a separated COVID world, et cetera, and what we idealize as the past interpersonal world, that tension is going to continue to create. But I think at the end of it, I also connect the dots. I think the fundamental nature of human relationships are not going to change. Maybe over the course of another 1,000 years, but not over the next lifetime of any of us on this call. I think it's fundamental. So basically no big change.
All right.
That'd be my guess.
And I would say I'm probably not that far away from you. I think the potential for further, let's call it commoditization of relationships and the degradation of relationship will continue. The potential of that will continue, which therefore raises the importance of the ability to connect, of connection. And that I don't think will decline either. And I might think that one of the areas in the search for common ground that has perhaps recently been eroded that may now reestablish themselves a little bit more is the question, is there a greater connection to be built on evidence of shared values of common ground? We've been through a period recently, at least in much of the Western world, where there's been some degradation of that. And I suspect what that can therefore say is, this isn't going to get any less important.
Yeah.
The work we do.
All right. You guys, thank you both so much. We've got 15 minutes set aside for Q&A. There are a few questions in the chat that I'm going to come back to, but I'm going to take the interviewer's prerogative and ask the first question. Because while you were both talking about your crystal ball, I want to ask you to just, what's your perspective briefly on, we talked about the impact of technology in changing how we interact with people. For somebody of our generation, that's massive, right? I mean, when I was growing up, I called my friends from the phone that was attached to the wall with a 20-foot curly cord that we could take and sneak into a closet somewhere if we needed privacy.
Right.
You've got a generation of leaders that are already in the workforce and moving forward who grew up with devices in their hands. And so to them, this interaction, this electronic digital interaction is not as foreign. It's not as big of a deal as it is to us. How do you see that generational shift impacting how we think about trust, that intergenerational change?
Well, you want me to take that, Rob, first?
Sure.
I think we, the older generation, need to get over that. The qualitative experience that people have, younger folks on the iPhone and whether it's TikTok or whatever, it's not qualitatively different than what you used to have with the curly Q wire in the closet. It's the same experience. The ways you get there are different. And as you said, the younger people don't get that, or they don't see it as different in the way that we do. I think that's on us. On the other hand, I do think there's recent stuff that suggests that particularly younger generation, post-millennial, like under 23 or so, there may be, I'm not really sure about this, less of an inclination to trust others, a lower propensity to trust, a greater risk aversion. And that's more worrisome. Because there's this connection between trusting and being trusted. One of the best ways to make somebody trustworthy is to trust them. And if you can't trust other people, there's no good reason that they will trust you. And in fact, they won't. So I worry about that a bit. And I'm tentative about that. I'm not sure the data's in on that. And I'm not entirely sure how to think about altering it, but that's what I think about.
Okay. Rob, do you want to add to that?
No, I don't think. I mean, I think Charlie points out one of the most important things here is it's sort of what we assume is part of our reality, and not assume is part of it, what we experience. Your phone example of that, in the closet was a clear one to that. Technology is everything that's invented after we're born. You're always kind of jumping on this. No one thinks of a refrigerator as technology, but to our grandparents and great grandparents, that was technology. Holy sugar! So to us, it's how we live.
I love it. Good. So what I'm hearing from you kind of is I think it's an awareness. What we refer to sometimes as the platinum rule. Like the golden rule is do unto others as you would have done unto you. The platinum rule is do unto others as you would have done unto them. They would have done unto them.
They've done unto right.
Yeah.
So there are other variations on the golden rule, like the Hollywood golden rule: the person with the gold makes the rules. The New York golden rule: do unto others before they do it to you. But we digress. We digress.
We are digressing. So we do have some questions, and I'm going to come back to this. Charlie, you referenced this briefly in passing as we were talking, and so I want to go back to Michael McFerrin's question. How do you establish a trust relationship in today's environment where meetings are virtual and many of the personal interactions are so restricted? Can you give us alternatives to being a trusted? Can you give us alternatives to begin a trusted relationship?
Yeah, Zoom. I mean, we all started off the Zoom experience thinking that it's, two-dimensional, flat, zero backgrounds. Listen, you can reach in and you can reach back and you can raise your voice and you can lower your voice. You can do chat. You can do interesting visuals, and you can, more importantly, you can have substantive conversations. The glass is actually half full. We used to say, like, I got a call the other day or an email from some guy 20 miles away from me saying, hey, would you like to have coffee? Well, having coffee in this day of COVID from somebody 20 miles away, that's a big deal. That's at least half a day, right? It's not half a day on Zoom anymore. I think that we vastly underestimate the potential personal connection power of this video thing that we're all getting better at. Think about your background. Watch all the cable news people. You notice how we hone in on their background? What are those books on the bookcase there? How come he's got bananas in the bowl today instead of apples? What's going on? Make your background.
Where's the cat? Right. Yeah.
And the cat, right, exactly. Open yourself up to communicate with people on Zoom. I don't think we need to wait for it to be over.
Good. Great. All right, there's another question. This one's from Mark Hurwitz. It seems like we're in a time of great liminality. There is so much unknown and in between, yet our training tends to make us push for an answer when maybe waiting in uncertainty is the best path. Any comments on this from a TA, from a trusted advisor perspective?
Rob, you want to take that?
Let's see, give me that one again.
Yeah, so there's a lot of unknown and in between right now, right? Things are
Right.
right. But our training tends to make us want to push for an answer when maybe waiting in the uncertainty is best.
Right. And you don't want to wallow. There's a difference between waiting in the uncertainty and wallowing in the uncertainty.
Waiting in the uncertainty.
Right.
Sorry.
I think that there's a, I think it's helpful to to at least have a point of view. So in some ways, what's your starting point? Do you have a working hypothesis, a set of guiding principles that you can at least begin with, that's going to kind of govern where you go from? I mean, I always go, there's sort of I call it the G's. You go from your goals to guiding principles here. And then after guiding principles, you can go to guidelines, and then you can go to guardrails. I mean, you can kind of narrow down what you can and can't do. I say, start with a little bit of openness. You don't have to be.
Let me add to that, to Mark's question. I think take a small example of that waiting. We all know this in a conversation, the power of hesitation. Wait an extra half second, and what happens? The other person then fills in something.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot to be said for waiting. There's also a lot to be said by saying, well, help me understand that. Go a little deeper. What's behind that? Encourage the other person to bring forth where they're coming from. That's the basis of greater connection. So I think Mark.
Better answer.
Yeah.
Better answer, Charlie. Good.
Whatever.
All right. I'm going to come back and ask you, let's dive a little deeper, and I'm not organizing these questions, so I appreciate you guys just going with the flow. Okay. It's a bit disjointed. Going back to that concept of intergenerational work teams, Barbara Kimmel asks specifically, hi Barbara, specifically about the trust equation and how it applies to intergenerational work teams. Any thoughts on that?
I have, my experience is, and I don't mean this as an advertisement for it, it's not necessarily the be all and end all. I have yet to experience, when I've been working with varying generations or intergenerational work teams, any difference in how they accept it, how they understand it, how they incorporate it. So it's a hard one for me to say, gee, that while these factors, I think, affect us all individually, in the intergenerational teams, the mixed sort of things where you've got senior, junior, younger, older, different, completely, diverse teams, not just from the age standpoint, I have not seen an issue here. Maybe I'm missing something, or maybe I'm kind of Pollyanna-ish in this world, but it's been, I think people can find their own analogies. They can find their own things about it. I think we lucked into something that has tended to be a little bit more evergreen than we thought, or would have.
Yeah, you look at all the different, pros, cons, black, white, on, off. There's race, there's gender, there's culture.
Charlie, are you frozen or?
Among those things, I think that the intergenerational thing may not be the most powerful. I think that levels are problematic for trust. Like if you're dealing with your boss or a subordinate, that's a significant hindrance or difficulty to come up with. But I don't think the intergenerational thing is necessarily as hard as dealing with people from a different culture. And it's similar. It's all the same stuff, and on a way, everybody's different than you are. The challenge is to find the commonalities with every single person you deal with.
Right.
Some of them happen to have these extra things layered on top of it.
Right. And I think Barbara's point is important, not from the standpoint of the intergenerational, but sometimes it's hard to speak truth to power. Yeah. And I think what's most critical here is how can we find, are there tools, are there mechanisms that we can use? And go back to the book, name it and claim it. How do we use something of almost a disclaimer to say, hey, I got an uncomfortable question here, but I want to ask it anyway. Or what's our technique, what's our approach that we can use when we feel that these other factors that make us different, and power may be one of them in particular. Yeah.
So following up on that, Sonia Nissan sent a question, and forgive me if I butcher names here. And she points out that it's interesting, a lower propensity to trust for young people, but a real need for connection. How do we get these trust principles across to younger people so they can increase their ability to connect?
It's a great question. I don't have an answer other than one person at a time. I have devoted my life not to thinking about social change questions, but more the psychological end of things. So my answer, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. My nail is one person at a time. You make those connections with somebody, you help bring them along the path to the best of your ability, and then go on to somebody else. But I know that's not a satisfactory answer. I just don't know the social engineering answer to that.
I don't have a broad social engineering answer, but I apply one filter to what Charlie, what I think is your very appropriate one person at a time, or step by step. And that's the risk adjusted approach, or to add some risk assessment, I should say. What's the risk? What's the downside? What's the danger of putting yourself either out there just a tiny bit more here, or taking the bolder step? And I think sometimes, that's sort of the S in the trust equation in some ways. We don't want to overstep our bounds. We don't want to come across to it. We don't want to risk. We don't want to make a mistake. And at the same time, I'd say, look, do a better job that you're comfortable with evaluating what's the downside.
Which is usually not
each
nearly what you think it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know more than you think you know, a Charlie Green equation of a long time ago.
And Rob, I just want to follow up on that because it seems like it's connected. Jeff Davis made a comment. It seems like connecting with Gen Z and younger millennials begins with showing a genuine interest in them, who they are and what they think. This is, in my opinion, of course. So the active listening mentioned earlier is key.
Yep. And I think that's valid for every generation. And
Right.
But it's worth stressing, as he just did. That's key to them too.
Yeah. And it's authenticity. It's not just using language or thinking, hey, I'll go and find out what the phrase is. I mean, it really is people, if they really feel that they are being listened to, they really can sense that, it's the you can't fake sincerity thing coming up.
Yeah, it's you get me. I'll toss in just a tiny little anecdote on my behalf of this. As I think about the new generations, and when I was teaching in an MBA program recently, one thing that really struck me about newer generations is the tendency is not the right word, but the propensity that the younger generation seems to have for tattoos.
Yeah.
Because for my generation, I was a little bit horrified because tattoos had an entirely different social meaning.
Yeah.
And it took a really interesting conversation with my niece about what tattoos mean to that generation for me to be able to shift my framework, to get out of my own self-orientation and recognize it not as what it means to me, but what it means to them.
Right.
Yeah, perfectly interesting example. I think you're exactly spot on. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Next question. I think we have time for maybe one more. And let's go with David News. So you brought up the topic of ghosting earlier. It has always been an issue for those of us in consulting or sales when clients go dark for long periods of time, and existing means of communication prove ineffective to keeping client engagement going. Any suggestions? Move on or just wait lest you be guilty of harassment?
Humor plays a role here. Sometimes you can sort of step outside it and say, listen, I tried all the usual things here. Obviously, one of 5 things must be going on. Number 1, I'm a harasser as far as you're concerned. Number 2, you've been on a year-long journey around the world. Number 3, the dog ate your homework. And then you throw in, you're just too busy and this is really not high on your radar or something. 4 crazy things, intentionally crazy. And that gives the person a social excuse to say, haha, it's number 4. I really was busy, or I'm really not sure I'm interested. I think it's worth one shot outside the bounds and then write it off, walk away. Either they just plain are not interested and or they don't have the social comfort to tell you why. So, you can't convert everybody. You can't make everybody like you. Take your lumps and go off and find somebody else.
All right. Rob, anything to add?
No, I'd say exactly what Charlie said. The only thing, just a little bit of minor advice on it, is don't head the message last and final shot or one last warning or last try, try to engage one more time. Don't, because that headline, it's an easy one, knocked up, but otherwise what Charlie said.
Cool. Great advice. All right. We're at the end of our time together.
Okay.
I just have one quick question. Somebody asked about the possibility of getting autographed copies on request. And I'm not going to ask you to answer that because I don't want to put you on the hook right now. For the people who are asking for autographed copies, we will look into that and I'll give you an answer when we send out our follow-up email tomorrow. So keep an eye tuned on your email about that. Couple of resources for everybody. Do watch for the email tomorrow. We'll have some links back to relevant blog posts, other opportunities for you to explore more about what the authors have talked about today. If you haven't already gotten the book, I encourage you to go out and get it. The upgrades are great. And as someone pointed out, it's not a full rewrite, but it is definitely a more relevant treatment of such a classic topic. Tracy, let's go ahead and just get a quick question out there for folks. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Let us know how you enjoyed this webinar today. And as people are answering that question, I'm going to open it back up. Charlie and Rob, any last thoughts before we close down?
All right. Other than that, I think Charlie and I are both open to trying to figure out how to help people.
Awesome.
You know where to find us. We're not
Yeah.
that hard to find.
Yep.
Great.
Hope you enjoy the. Oh, by the way, just so everybody's clear, the yellow copy is the old original one. This gold one is the new one. If you go to Amazon in particular, you have to be precise about which one you want. It's easy to get defaulted to this one. It should be a couple items down the list, or make sure you put 20th anniversary in the title. But that's the new one, okay?
All right. Great. With that, I want to thank everybody very much for joining us, and especially Charlie and Rob. Thank you for spending your morning with us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks, Noelle.
Thank you.
Good.
Have a
Nicely
great
done.
day, evening, morning, everybody.